Hello and welcome to the last game that I want to show you from CCC 9's semifinals. This is a very nice attacking game against Komodo. The game started with e4, g6, d4, bishop g7, and we have a modern, also called Robatsch defense, where white occupied the center with both pawns and is controlling a ton of central squares. But black is okay with it because he intends to attack this center from the flanks and try to collapse it, and if he succeeds, then he will have a positional advantage. The game continued now with knight f3, and after d6 we reached the end of the book. From here on Leela is on her own, and here white has a couple of ideas for development. One is knight c3 to defend this pawn on e4, which is inevitably attacked by this knight coming to f6. And now play bishop e2 or h3 in view of bishop g4 attacking the knight, and then castle short and, continue from there. Another idea, instead of knight c3, is to play bishop c4 and after knight f6 defend this pawn on e4 with the queen, and then again castle and try to get in e5. But instead of these options, after d6, Leela went for a third one, which is less popular but nonetheless pretty good, and she played here bishop e2. And she intends to play queen d2 and then castle long. And now the game continued with knight f6, attacking this pawn on e4. Leela defends, a6, queen d2, and now after castles and knight c6, Leela decided that it's time for the attack, for the typical Harry attack with the pawn up the board, and she started this attack with bishop h6, which is a very good move, which not only intends to exchange black's best defender, this bishop on g7, but it also prevents black to play h5, and this now allows Harry to go up the board, exchange itself for the g6 pawn, and then the h file opens up. And all white needs to do then is to somehow get with the queen onto the h-file and mate the black king on h8. This is a very simplistic and crude idea, but very effective. How is Komodo defending that? Well, he started off with b5, and he intends to play b4 and then take this pawn on e4. And here now Leela has a couple of different options to defend. One of them is a3, and this just quite simply stops the b pawn. Another one is to play queen f4 and defend this e4 pawn with the queen. However, bishop d3 is not a good option because now this allows black to play e5, and after pawn takes and pawn takes, Leela can't win on e5 because this bishop is in the way. Without this bishop, she could take on d8 twice, and when the knight recaptures, then she could win this pawn on e5. Leela, however, went again for a different option, and here in this position she played d5 and she attacks this knight. And here are a couple of lines now for black that don't work. One of them is b4. Here Leela can just simply take on g7, and after king takes, play knight b1, and this pawn on b4 is lost and white is better. Alternatively, instead of taking this bishop on g7, maybe black could try to take on c3 and attack the queen, but this doesn't work because now the queen can take on c3 and black has two pieces attacked, and again white is winning. So b4 doesn't work. Black could also maybe try knight e5, but this again allows Leela to continue her kingside attack because after knight takes and pawn takes, she can just simply play f3 to defend this pawn in view of b4, and then just continue her attack. And to a flank attack like this, black usually responds with a counterattack in the center, but here Leela's center is quite stable. For example, after something like e6, she can just ignore that and play h4, and if black takes here, well, she can play with a knight, and she's attacking this knight on f6, which is defending the h5 square. And if the knight takes here, then she can take with the pawn, and again she can continue with h5. Or alternatively, if instead of knight takes, black plays c6, Well, then again she can take on g7, and after king takes, take on f6, force the queen to take back, and then again h5 comes, and this rook can't really oppose on the d file. White is better. But after d5, Komodo went for knight a7, which is probably the better defense. Leela continued with rook e1, defending that pawn, and now we have c5 and h4. Leela continues her attack. Bishop takes on h6, queen takes on h6, and now knight g4. And this basically forces Leela's queen to go back to d2 and defend the f2 pawn. And here Komodo played a very good move. He played here h5, and this now basically stops any kind of h5 ideas by Leela. And it's very difficult now to open a file on the king side. White would need to play something like f3 and g4, but this seems very far-fetched now when Komodo's pawns are moving up very fast on the queen side. There's simply no time for f3 and g4. However, Leela is still not out of ideas, and she played very good. Knight d1. b4 is coming anyway, so this knight has to move. And now with knight d1, she's rerouting this knight to e3, where it can challenge this knight on g4. The game continued with b4, and after knight e3 and king g7, Leela found an amazing move. Komodo was expecting some quiet moves like bishop c4 and then knight b5 and king b1 and rook a7 and knight takes on g4, bishop takes on g4, knight h2, bishop d7, and so on, with white still having an attack but nothing serious. However, after king g7, Leela sacked his knight with knight f5 check. And she thought that this knight is immune. If black takes the knight, then it's over. And she was expecting now king g8 and knight h2 and knight takes and rook takes and e5 and pawn takes and bishop takes and so on, but not taking this knight on f5. However, Komodo thought that this knight on f5 is just too dangerous and it's paramount to take him out, and he did with the g pawn. And now Leela continued with queen g5 check, king h7, queen takes on h5, king g7, queen back to g5 check, king h7, and now she took the pawn on f5. And she's attacking both the knight on g4 and this pawn on e7. And now something like rook g8 fails because of queen h5 check, and if now the king comes back to the g file, then black just loses this knight for free. And after something like knight h6, there comes bishop d3 with the very deadly threat of playing f6 and forcing this king away from the knight, and with a mate to follow. And if black plays here f6, well, then knight g5 also ends the game very nicely, because the king has to move. If it goes to the g file, then queen g6 crashes through, and if this pawn takes here instead, then again f6 and game over. The king has to leave, and then queen takes on h6 is mate. So after he takes on f5, Komodo played knight f6, and now this defends both the knight and the pawn on e7. And Leela now just simply continued her attack with g4, and if allowed she would like to retrieve the queen and then get in g5. And she's not afraid at all of rook g8, because now after queen e3, this pawn on g4 is immune. If black takes here, then the g file opens up and the black king will be in big trouble. Just to illustrate, if knight takes on g4, then there's knight g5 check. And after king g7, there's queen f4 attacking the knight. And after the knight retreats, there's rook g1. And there are very big threats against the black king. And he cannot hide. If he tries to hide, then there's knight a7 check. And black has nothing better than taking this knight. But then comes queen h6, forcing the king away from the rook. Or the rook has to play here rook g7, which is the best line. And after queen takes and king moves away, the queen takes the knight, and white is quite simply winning in this position. Alternatively, instead of taking with the knight, Black can take on g4 with the rook, but this leads to the same problem after the same knight g5 check, because now after king g8 there's bishop e2, and black has nothing better than to take on f5 and give up the rook, but after bishop takes there's rook g1, and the open g file leads again to the black king's doom. After queen d7 there's f3 forcing the bishop back, and now white has this very strong knight e6 check preventing the king to escape via f8. And now after bishop g6 there's queen h6 threatening mate on g7, and after the pawn takes on e6 and rook takes on g6 the black king gets mated in a couple of moves here. So after queen e3 taking on g4 not being an option, Komodo played here king h8, but now this allowed queen h6 check forcing the knight to h7, and now Leela continued with bishop d3, and she threatens here to play f6 and then mate the king by taking the knight on h7. And if black plays here f6 trying to stop it, well then Leela has g5 and she crashes through. She can play g6 and then win the spin knight. Instead of this, Komodo tried to exchange the queens with queen f8, but Leela avoided that, and now Komodo played the very tricky rook g7 here, and his idea is that now after f6 there's bishop g4 and there's no mate on a7 because the rook guards the knight, and this is still winning for white, but white lost the pawn on g4. So Leela goes for the same variation but without losing this pawn. So here she played first g5, and after knight b5 she played f6, and after e takes and g takes on f6 Komodo played bishop g4, and now being an exchange up, Leela just exchanged now into winning endgame. She took the rook on g7 with check, queen takes, and now she took the knight, bishop takes on f3, rook h3, and in this position black has a couple of options. He can take on d5 or play knight d4 and defend the bishop, or even take on a7, but none of them really works for black. White is winning. Komodo went for knight d4, and now we have bishop d3, bishop takes on d5, c3, knight back, and now in order to save this pawn on a2, Leela played bishop e4, pinning this bishop to the rook, and now the bishop takes, rook takes, b takes on c3, b takes on c3, rook d8, and they both have 4 pawns, but Leela is up the exchange, and that is just quite simply a decisive advantage. Leela now attacks the a pawn with rook a4, the knight defends, and now she goes for the f pawn, the rook defends, and after rook g4 she threatens this very subtle mate on h5, but the knight comes back to defend. But now after rook g5 Komodo defends with f6, but this loses now the f6 pawn, and after a couple of more moves Komodo plays here d5, and Leela now tries to get that one, and in the process she will lose the f2 pawn, but now Komodo will lose these other 2 pawns very quickly. And in this process Leela is even allowing this fork, and after rook a5 Komodo could take on g5, but taking there is just completely hopeless. Leela will just move up the board with her king and allow the c-pawn to become a queen, and that's it. The game continued now with rook f1, rook g4, and there goes Komodo's last pawn. And from here on is really just a walk in the park. She will move up the board with the h-pawn and the a-pawn, and eventually she will give up the h-pawn, but she will promote the a-pawn to a queen. And then she will of course give up her queen and one of the rooks, and then she will mate with the remaining rook. Here we see now the a-pawn becoming a queen shortly. The rook has been given up, and shortly the knight will be also taken. And here goes the queen, and now she will give up that rook, and then it's just really an elementary mate. with some difficulties, but in the end there is the mate on the AJ square. So this was a very nice kingside attack, a hairy attack by Leela with an awesome knight sack on f5. Please subscribe, like and share, and check out some of the other games. Thanks for watching and see you soon. Bye bye.